Kia ora koutou. Good evening, everybody. I'll just get technology sorted here, make sure that's working so you can see my slides. Yeah, you can see my slides, Graham, just to confirm that. Great, awesome. Hello, Deborah, good to see you as well. So, hey, thanks for coming along to the final evening of Faith Thinking on Zoom. The plan for this evening is to give you a traditional sort of public lecture. I plan to speak for hopefully about 35 to 40 minutes, and then open up to questions and discussion. The topic is surveillance and sociality, so smart living in historical and future cities. Against the backdrop of the challenges of climate change, environmental degradation, population growth, and economic inequality, politicians, urban policymakers, planners and developers, academics, environmentalists, and civil society activists offer future visions for cities employing the discourse of livable cities. Alongside this discourse of livability, a range of other terms are often used in currency, including the increasingly utilized idiom of smart cities. Silicon Valley corporations and IT companies in this idiom advance a vision of cities with a panoply of embedded digital technologies to help mitigate the ecological, security, and inequality risks that contemporary cities face. Perhaps the most well-known of these smart city projects is the failed venture undertaken by Sidewalk Labs in Toronto. In October 2017 in Toronto, Canada, Waterfront Toronto, which was the government agency who was overseeing the development of 2,000 acres along the eastern shores of Lake Ontario, announced that Sidewalk Labs had submitted the winning proposal to redevelop the Quayside site. 12 acres located less than 1.5 kilometres from the central business district. And you can see that in the image here. Sidewalk Labs, a subsidiary of Alphabet, which is AKA Google, offered a futuristic vision of technological smart city within a city. It was a city that comprised of robot taxis. All right, I'll just flick the thing. Of robot taxis, heated sidewalks that would melt snowfall, autonomous garbage collection, and unsurprisingly, an extensive matrix of technology that would monitor and collect data on an array of activities undertaken within the city, everything from crossing the street to the use of park benches. Sidewalk Labs' winning proposal did not involve, as per the norm, the client paying millions to the contractor, but rather the reverse. In this case, the contractor, Sidewalk Labs, aka Google, would pay the City of Toronto $50 million for the opportunity to develop the site. 9 months later, the Waterfront Toronto's board approved a project development agreement between themselves and Sidewalk Labs. The agreement gave significant control to Sidewalk in determining the future relationship between the City of Toronto and what that would look like once the development itself was completed. And central to this agreement was Google's ability to be able to gather and control the vast amount of data that the completed city would produce. This smart city vision and the plan that Sidewalk Lab was proffering was in continuity with Google's overarching business strategy. In her 2019 critically acclaimed book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, Shoshana Zuboff outlines the fact that we are now transitioning into a new period of global technological capitalism. The new commodity in the 21st century is not silver, gold, coal, or oil, or other fossil fuels, but is data, and in particular, human data. Within industrial capitalism, resources were extracted from nature, turned into commodities, and then sold to generate profit. But in this emerging age of surveillance capitalism, it is not the natural world, but humanity that is the raw material. Every day as we send emails, utilize Google search, update our social media accounts, make online purchases, and use the apps on our smart devices, we relinquish information about ourselves to the most wealthy and powerful corporations in human history. In this new iteration of global techno-capitalism, it is information about our lives, in other words, behavioral surplus, which is the new resource that is being mined and harvested. This data, generated by our willing participation in the digital world, and simply as a case of walking around with smart devices in our hands, is captured by these large companies, Google, Facebook / Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, and an increasing number of other companies. It is then fed into powerful computational software designed by some of the world's most intelligent IT and behavioral scientists. The thousands of individual data points created and harvested each day tell about our physical movements, our product preferences, our dietary choices, our modes of transport, our employment status, our leisure activities, and our network of families and friends. And all this information contributes to corporations developing an ever clearer picture about each one of us. This processed data then becomes a commodity in itself. It shifts here from being behavioral surplus to being a commodity that can be harnessed for behavioral prediction. That is, the algorithms will tell people, will give a tremendous capacity to predict how we will behave in light of our previous choices. And specifically, it then gives the possibility for these organizations to be involved in advertising nudges, that is, to push us towards making certain choices. The company's deep knowledge of our previous behavior and deep intimate knowledge about our self-identity, including our deepest fears and desires, is then combined with techniques of tuning, herding, and conditioning, with the ultimate aim of achieving behavioral modification. The Holy Grail thus is not merely prediction, but the ability to determine our behavior as consumers, thus guaranteeing sales and therefore increasing revenue. Essentially, the growth of global techno-capitalism, therefore, is human futures. And to compete in this market, one needs to mine the limitlessness of the lived human experience. The more data of human experience one is able to gather to be processed by powerful algorithms, the more accurate the model for predicting human behavior, and thus the better one is able to target advertising nudges to determine future human behavior. With all this being the case, it's unsurprising, therefore, that Alphabet / Google was willing to pay $50 million for the Quayside project. In fact, sensor-laden cities, smart cities, are not new. They're already being developed and exist in places like China and in Persian Gulf states. What Toronto provided was the ideal opportunity for a proof of concept for future urban smart cities in Western liberal democratic societies. Quayside offered a real-life laboratory in which voracious data collection could be integrated into the very design and construction of the built environment. Within months of being announced, Sidewalk's plan began to meet resistance, and in particular here from the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, who spearheaded the fight against the project. And fundamental to their fight was questions of privacy. They argued, we're fighting here for the fundamental human right to privacy and all the other rights that privacy supports, including free expression and association. This framing of the issue in a simple way in terms of framing the question around privacy, and in particular questions of both privacy and how surveillance impacts on privacy, was an effective communication strategy, but I would suggest is also somewhat problematic. And this is for two reasons. Firstly, to frame the question around the principle of privacy and the phenomenon of surveillance itself is to fail to recognize that questions of privacy and surveillance are not specific to late modern global techno-capitalism, but rather are age-old and are as long as human societies themselves. I've recently, for fun, been reading material on the life of the Presbyterian Church in 16th century Scotland. Some of you will be very pleased about that. And it's a fascinating insight in terms of social history about compulsory attendance at church and the fact that elders were sent out during church time to walk around and to surveil and to watch for the non-attendees. Neighbours were encouraged to dob in their neighbours for being drunk, violent, and unsurprisingly for any sexual misdemeanours they may be involved in, especially adultery. And those who were discovered through the surveillance were brought before elders and faced a range of penalties. Rebuke before the elders, public confession before the church, which included sitting on the penance stool, a stool without a backing on it, and one had to sit almost like sort of the dunce corner on the front of that stool for public shaming. There was the payment of monetary fines, there was the withholding of communion, or most drastic, there was the penalty of excommunication. To our modern sensibilities, such invasion of private lives and a communal form of discipline sounds outrageous and terrible. And yet, within this surveillance society, this was not only accepted, but actually actively participated in by the vast majority. Scottish Presbyterians in the 16th century understood that the application of ethical discipline was necessary to be the holy people of God. And so that's a sort of an aside, but I want to suggest, therefore, that framing the question purely around the phenomenon of surveillance and privacy, therefore, is insufficient. The second problem with framing it in such a way is that if we view privacy as the ideal to be protected and surveillance as an ailment to be eliminated, it fails to appreciate the ambiguity of these concepts themselves. Privacy and secrecy are not always moral goods, and surveillance is not essentially a negative activity. Indeed, to assess and evaluate concepts of privacy and the activity of surveillance involves not just the discussion of the means, but also the telos, or the ends of those means which are being served. One might think here about practical examples, the careful, close attention, the surveillance which is part and parcel of our lives, the watching of children, particularly if you're at a beach or in a dangerous situation, the scientific method, the careful scrutinous and observation, both within the Western scientific method, but also within Mataranga Māori, the idea of observing and recording what we are watching. And here recognizing that this surveillance is undertaken for a certain reason, which is to understand, to grow in knowledge, and one arguably could also say within an epistemology of love. Closer to home, maybe, or thinking through the sort of the policing question of surveillance, you might want to think about just over a year ago and the lone wolf terrorist attack that took place in the Newlyn Countdown supermarket in Auckland, and the way in which the perpetrator of that violence was apprehended almost immediately before further damage could be done. Again, this was possible because of the surveillance that was taking place. Accordingly, therefore, I want to suggest that what is required is a much more nuanced understanding than simply a knee-jerk sort of reaction to questions of privacy and surveillance. This sort of reflection, therefore, observes the inherent equivocality of these terms and phenomenon, and therefore notes the particular ways in which our conception and experience of privacy and surveillance are themselves changing in our emerging age of surveillance capitalism. And so therefore, in the rest of tonight, what I want to do is offer sort of a moral evaluation of the role of surveillance and data collection, particularly within our so-called smart cities. My reflection, therefore, is situated between a radical rejection or an uncritical endorsement, seeking to both note the possibilities and pitfalls of digital surveillance. And in reflecting critically upon the nature of current surveillance technologies, I want to ask to what extent these may help or hinder the development of authentic sociality within our cities. And so I move sort of to the substantive part of the paper here, which is reflecting firstly on the rationality, rhetoric, and reality of smart cities. I've already noted the significance of data within the age of surveillance capitalism. Human living in our digital technological world produces voluminous data, and this data is collected, analysed, and then finally, once processed, is utilised. while we as a general population are increasingly aware of the extent to which this data is vacuumed up by these large corporations, and this is, I think, particularly recently, probably in the last couple of years, through educational movies or documentaries such as Social Media, The Great Hack, or just recently, in fact, I think last week on TV1, Web of Chaos. And so I think there is a much greater awareness of the way in which surveillance and data collection is now not confined sort of just to our portable device. So I think there's a greater awareness of that. But what we, I think, are unfamiliar with is the way in which this is not just confined to our portable devices, but is already embedded within the physical material world that we live in. That is, mass surveillance and data collection is not simply undertaken by the behemoth corporations of Silicon Valley through our engagement with social media and social search engines, but rather as a phenomenon that is already integral to contemporary cities. And here are 4 examples: airport check-in kiosks, self-service at grocery stores, the swipe cards on public transport, the use of library cards at self-service issuing kiosks. All of these gather data, collect data, which is then read by algorithms to create a picture of the people who are using them, but also more broadly, pictures about the way in which people are engaging with these services. The fact that this already exists means that design theorists draw attention to the fact that surveillance and data collection is already engaged in our built environment, and therefore that the world of real and virtual have already become overlaid with each other and are changing our conceptions of both temporality, that is time, but also spatiality of geographical space. Benjamin Bratton employs the metaphor of the stack, noting the way in which the layers of earth, cloud, city, address, interface, user all exist in their own right, but also intermingle and merge with one another. Stephen Graham notes the way in which ubiquitous smart devices create a computerized matrix. Quote, layered movement, interaction, consumption, and politics. Layered over and through everyday urban landscapes, bringing into being radically new styles of movement, interaction, consumption, and politics. In a sense, Graham argues, these become the city. Put simply, these theorists suggest that there is a symbiotic relationship between the matrix of digital technology and our physically constructed world. That is, at an ontological level, the data produced in the digital world shapes not just its user, but also the material world that we construct and inhabit. As Esther Kimoylan and Astrid Vervoiden say, the smart city bases its reality on data and turns that data back into reality. Proponents of smart cities see this data collection, analysing and utilisation in overwhelmingly positive terms. Contemporary cities, they contend, are facing particular challenges: growing populations and underdeveloped or ageing infrastructure, growing energy requirements, ecological challenges such as diminishing fresh water supplies and water quality, the impacts of climate change, rising sea levels, threats to biodiversity. Food security issues, in particular the complexity and the fragility of supply chains, public health risks. We've just been through one of these in a global pandemic, or perhaps we're still in it, and also increasingly sophisticated, well-organised criminal networks. And so for smart city advocates, digital surveillance and the collection, analysis and use of data is seen as a means to manage the increasing complexity of contemporary cities. And here's just some examples of some of the things that smart digital technologies are already involved in: smart government, manufacturing, smart cities, digital citizens, and health and farming, and energy use and production, and transportation, and smart buildings. Smart apps are also used by citizens to communicate, therefore, with city officials. And therefore, again, there's a range of smart data collecting apps that probably a number of you may well have on your phones or have experience of. So around the world, there are apps for people to report crime or antisocial behaviour, the reporting of water leaks, how to report or use an app to find out both up-to-date information on public transport, but also how to report on delays or problems on lines. Devices here that gather data and that then feed back that data around weeds or biodiversity threats, or on traffic issues. And so in each of these apps, what's taking place is that data is being collected by the citizen, is being analysed, and then being used in such a way to, quote, anticipate future needs and concerns, to plan strategically, to avoid loss, and to manage risk. To summarise what I've argued thus far, I've noted that there are three, I guess, features of contemporary surveillance cities. The first is that surveillance technology that are currently employed both shape their users, but also shape the city itself. Secondly is to note the rationality and rhetoric of technology companies that face this complexity and uncertainty and suggest that these technologies will help predict, plan, and protect for our future. But thirdly, to note, therefore, the inherent ambiguity in digital surveillance employed within cities. And there are three brief examples there to think through these three sort of dynamics that I've already talked about, therefore, and just to give you a case study here again. The first you might want to think about is the COVID Tracer app, which, of course, we've all just lived through. Here, designed to protect populations and to prevent the spread of a pandemic, and yet ambiguous because on the other side of it, there's also fallout that comes from that app, an exacerbated sense of helplessness for those who may already be feeling socially isolated and marginalised and who don't want to participate in using the app. And particularly for those people, a sense of depersonalisation, a sense of being treated as an outsider to the team of 5 million. Thinking here through the use of surveillance technology in terms of facial recognition, particularly that's being used in policing around the world. The focus here is on reducing crime. And yet many critics of such technology also note some of the potential dangers here that exist within this technology and the way in which this data is used. Concerns around the mass nature of the surveillance, in particular the way in which images of all people is then taken into this database, and questions therefore of privacy and protection of that data. Issues around the bias of the algorithm, and particularly with regard to the treatment of people of colour. These algorithms basically work because the data sets that are given to them are white people, and therefore people who aren't white often are seen therefore as potential perpetrators of future violence. Therefore exacerbating a sense of marginalisation, prejudice and mistreatment by authorities for such groups. Other concerns here is the very nature of what this technology says about our societies, a strong emphasis therefore on securitization, and the framing of the idea here that the city is at war, the idea here that we face the risk of burgeoning crime within our cities, and therefore the extensive and substantial sums of money that's spent on such surveillance technologies. And yet the overwhelming data of cities is that crime within Western liberal democracies is dropping. And so arguably the reason this technology is there is because technology securitization sells. This raises questions about opportunity costs, which is what would happen if this money that was spent on very expensive surveillance technology was instead spent on developing social capital or enhancing social capital or on producing job creation. How might the opportunity cost of this money create a greater sense of sociality and safety within the city? Also recognising here that these technologies are already at work in many places in the world, in London and San Francisco, where they were sort of pushed back quite strongly by the population. But in China, this is done and dusted. This is part of a social credit system where there is a regulation and controlling of citizens' behaviour. And a third example, therefore, and then you might want to reflect on this sort of reflection here about how this use of technology then frames the world in a certain way. And again, Kimoilan and Verwoden here say the problem with predictive policing is that it embodies the smart city's ideal that some urban conflicts are predictable, and that with the correct knowledge, that is data, any outcome can be encouraged or prevented. Securitization entails exhaustive in data collection, optimization in data analysis, and control in data use. Two examples I've given there. One is about sort of public health, one is about public security or public safety, but the third one is the idea of public play here. And the augmented reality game of 2016, Pokemon Go. Again, some of you may have participated in this. I was just actually gave a lecture on Monday, and one of the younger students told me what a great app this was and how fantastic it was as a way of encouraging citizens in a city to get out and about, to explore new parts of the city, how good it was for individual health and encouraged interactions between citizens and strangers. And therefore, all of this, he suggested, was strong for social cohesion and sociality. Indeed, this was much of the message that was sent by PR regarding those who were promoting the game. But I want to offer perhaps a bit more of a critical analysis of this, and in particular to ask questions about the way in which this technology may well decontextualize the very physical space of the cities that we live in. The city becomes, using this app, a giant playground, and therefore the deeper social, cultural, ecological, and historical realities that are part and parcel of our built, lived environments become overlaid or obscured. After all, gamers weren't being led through the city by this app on a historical trip, nor were they discovering the other species ecologically that inhabited the city. Rather, they were engaged with forms of technology that were created by humans and that were then mediated through the screen via augmented reality. And so arguably what was being created was a one-dimensional flattening surface. The real world was losing its depth. This loss of depth and context of the real world was perhaps most obviously expressed in some distressing locations. One was the Arlington National War Cemetery in Virginia in the States, and the other was the National Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, DC, where people with Pokemon machines ran around trying to find Pokemon in a war cemetery and a Holocaust museum. Recognizing here that Pokemon Go as well, the motivation for developing this app was not to get people out in their cities and engaging with sociality. It was developed by a side lab, which was an internal startup within Google. And that the reason for this was to basically run a laboratory game, which was to see how individuals using this app could be nudged or coerced or encouraged in certain directions and certain behavior, and therefore providing a case study here of to what extent apps could be used to encourage behavioural modification. To reiterate here, what I'm suggesting here with these three examples is the way in which public health, public security, and public play illustrate my initial three observations. That is that technology shapes its users and the sociality of cities, but also to note that the rationality and rhetoric of technology companies is that we can predict and plan and protect the future. There is a strong salvific rhetoric that takes place amongst these companies. The idea here that they will provide the future of our cities. But thirdly, also to note the inherent ambiguity about these technology. I don't want to write them off completely. I just want to be more nuanced. Ultimately here, going on beneath the surface here is a question here, not just about the telos or the ends of human sociality and the way in which we construct our cities, but questions here about the metaphysic that is at work within technology, that is reflecting upon technology itself. Often we think of technology as some sort of neutral tool. But the work of Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, is quite helpful in the 20th century. And he notes that embedded within technology, there is always an inherent metaphysic at work. Technology, Heidegger suggests in his book, The Question Concerning Technology, is not merely a tool, but rather is a way of framing and seeing and thus interpreting and being in the world. Heidegger argues that we generally tend to employ an instrumental analysis when reflecting upon the use of technologies. That is, we tend to ask the question, does this means of technology lead to a good end, or does it lead to a bad end, or is it in and of itself neutral? Heidegger argues that actually this way of analysing technology or focusing on the ends of technology doesn't really show us technology's essence. And Heidegger wants to suggest that a way of thinking about technology is to note that technology is not fundamentally a machine, a tool, or a device, but rather is, quote, a mode of being, a way of revealing the world. In contrast to sort of our modern understanding, where we tend to draw a strong distinction between knowledge, this idea of theory, and technology, that is this idea that we have a set of theories and then we apply it in practical knowledge, Heidegger emphasizes that there is a close relationship between these terms. That is, that the very nature of techne, or craft, or something that we use, is in and of itself a form of knowledge, a way of knowing and being in the world. To summarize, therefore, for Heidegger, technology is a way of knowing which shapes our understanding and engagement with the world. In Heidegger's thinking, in our modern age, we have embraced a metaphysic of technology. This means that not just machines and technical processes, but all entities, that is nature and humanity itself, now present themselves to us according to this logic or rationality, this metaphysic of technology. Heidegger thinks there's therefore two critical aspects about this technology's way of being, which he points out to us. And he doesn't make an evaluative judgment on this, he's just observing. And he suggests that the logic of technology is that it's utilitarian. What happens is that entities come to be seen as an entity in and of themselves. And the classic example he uses here is the idea of, or perhaps the best example to think of, is the idea of a forest as standing timber. I went for a tramp once with a friend, and we were talking about how foresters will talk about a forest as standing timber, because already their framing of the world means that they see the forest as a resource to be utilized. As well as this utilitarian way of framing the world, the second thing about technology, Heidegger says, is that it means that we tend to see the world in a non-relational way. We tend to see it in a fragmentary way, as dislocated or alienated. I suggest here that Heidegger provides a helpful way for framing, therefore, questions around engaging with smart cities, because it doesn't go, our current thinking about the ends of technology and the ways in which they achieve certain ends, doesn't ask the fundamental question, which is the essence of technology itself, and noting the way, therefore, in which I want to suggest the metaphor of the smart city and the digital technology in that smart city itself is illustrative of the way in which we have them framed and we see the world, seeing the world and framing the world according to the logic of late modern digital utopianism. And this is manifested in particular in the age of surveillance capitalism. Ultimately, I want to suggest that this sort of framing of the world is problematic for four reasons. And first of these I want to suggest is at an epistemological level. That is, it shapes the way in which we think about and know the world around us. In particular, a strong emphasis within these technologies on quantification, measuring, predictability, and control. These become the key determinants. Ultimately, anything within this framing of the world that cannot be measured as data is not conceived or perceived as real as such. Such a reductionist epistemology should, I suggest, has its helpfulness, but can only be applied to a limited set of criteria. Maybe in a smart city to do with issues such as water use, or energy use, or transport efficiencies and utilizations. But can this sort of reductionist way of reading the world be then laid across human sociality or non-living realities? In fact, even the example there of water, that certain framing of the water here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, there's a different way of framing the water, which would be to understand an awa as one's tupuna. And therefore that frames the relationship one has in very different ways than framing it purely in a data way. And again, maybe those things go together. I want to suggest here that the problem with sort of purely seeing the world through these lenses is that if we were to simply define livable cities according to this sort of framework or this epistemology, is that there's a whole lot of data that cannot be communicated as data. There are essential aspects of our shared city life and of human sociality itself that don't correlate with the values of efficiency or future predictability or safety/security. I think here of maybe expressions such as Mardi Gras or carnivals or city celebrations or events where there is a vitality of joie de vivre, which can't be captured necessarily through quantification and measurement. One might say 30,000 people turned up at that game to watch the game of rugby, but one can't capture and record the true sociality that took place there. And so there were qualities that we will want to, I would suggest, see as significant for livable cities of the future, but which that sort of way of framing the world cannot capture, or are more likely to elide or extinguish. Ideas of beauty, a sense of belonging, the trust of police and authorities, or the ability to contribute to the life of the city. Secondly, I want to suggest that such a technological framing through sort of mass surveillance and through data collection is also a somewhat problematic in terms of our understanding of anthropology. That is, it tends to depersonalize and de-subjectify us, to use a Foucauldian term. Ultimately, within this framing of the world, cities become composed of atomized individuals who inhabit a shared space. And fundamentally what humans are is a limitless resource of life experience that can be collected as data, analysed and used. We get the datification of human life. Such a reductionist anthropology then also leads to a truncated conception of the polis, of the political space. And so my third point here is that these technology therefore lead to a reductionist understanding of being the polis. Here, within this framing of the world, city dwellers are seen as citizens who contribute to the political life or the social life, possibly, but if so, how? Primarily, it operates through digital devices again, and I gave some examples, therefore, of collecting data and passing on that data for the techno-bureaucrats who will then process that data. And this strikes me as problematic, and particularly in liberal Western societies, where we're increasingly facing a dropping number of political participation, except for the most recent elections, which actually led to higher numbers of participants in local body and city elections. But prior to that, it's been dropping for a number of decades. We're increasingly facing a lack of trust between citizens and political authorities, and we're increasingly facing a drop in social engagement and volunteerism. And so therefore the question is, to what extent do these smart cities employing digital surveillance technology and data engagement, to what extent do they encourage citizens to grow and to become more integrated and engaged? Is this simply a passive view of citizenship, limited to legal status with rights and duties, or is it a more active concept of citizenship, where involved members of the community can contribute to the governance and its defence? An example here, questions of water here. Are citizens reduced to simply providing, uploading data and linking into solutions that have already been decided by the data analysis by the techno-bureaucrats, as Alistair McIntyre might suggest them, or are citizens involved in the very process of negotiating and navigating what are the issues, what do we want to prioritise? And here, one of the fascinating pieces of technology that actually engages with that is the work of Lumio, which is a originally New Zealand-based piece of technology, of digital technology, which engages others in a social democracy group-solving approach. Final comment therefore about this way in which this technological framing of the world, as I've already implied, is therefore concerns about what this does to place, and whether therefore such technology, surveillance technologies, actually mean that a re-engagement with place becomes difficult, because actually the embodied world that we live in itself becomes decontextualized and disenchanted. It simply becomes the backdrop for human production of data and resources to be quantified and managed. In a longer paper here, I make a reflection here on the way in which the Tower of Babel story actually mirrors some of the realities that we face. A story here of a shared common language, which leads to a development of a new technology. And this technology leads to the building of a city. Ultimately, the city here, Babel, itself becomes a centralized hegemonic sort of power here within what becomes Babylon. And we all know how the biblical story sees the world of Babylon. It's interesting here to note the ways in which this narrative echoes our own. The sense here in which the city operates as a vanity project for its builder echoes here of this in our own reality. And the way here in which there is a feedback loop that takes place. And so surveillance technology here, sorry, I've just lost my place. Sorry, the shared cultural imagination here within the Babel story here, which is a shared language, which leads to a shared technology, and then leads to a shared undertaking of lived experience. But also noting that this works back the other way itself, that the creating of the city then reinforces this cultural imagination, this way of framing the world. And so this then leads to a promoting of these technologies and this lived experience. So essentially what we get is a feedback loop, reflective of our earlier comment here, which is that the city bases its reality on a certain episteme, and that likewise this episteme then shapes the reality which is being viewed. So what might this mean for us reflecting? I think there's some real richness here with the story of the Tower of Babel. But ultimately, it seems to me that part of our journey as we ask these questions of technology is begin to therefore offer larger or richer conceptions of what the city might be. And here thinking through a theological conception that would repersonalize a city, or in particular, repersonalize the city dwellers, so that they don't simply become citizens who are engaged through smart devices, but they are once again given an understanding here of being citizens engaging in the life and the polis of the city. And therefore, a reintegration and a re-engagement with citizens, and fundamentally also therefore a recontextualization and a re-enchanting of cities, and therefore the embodiment of cities. In summary, what I've suggested here is that surveillance technologies already exist within our societies, and that therefore they can potentially contribute to an authentic sociality, but I'll leave it up for debate. I've also suggested that there are some legal questions here regarding how these technologies are used, questions on who designs them, who controls them, and who controls the data. Further, I've suggested that there are questions regarding the very nature of these technologies. That is, what is the purpose or the telos of these technologies? Do they genuinely contribute to the enhancement of human sociality, or are they simply a Trojan horse here, another means of data extraction for the generation of profits for giant corporations? To what extent does the salvific rhetoric of technology that seeks to predict, secure, and control the future, to what extent is this inherently problematic? That is, does the attempt to predict, secure, and control inevitably sow the seeds of its own destruction? If true, authentic sociality requires foundations of trust and respect, this raises questions about how such digital technologies may be employed in the first place. How might they deepen trust within our society between those who govern and those who are governed, between citizens themselves? How, echoing here the story of the Babel story, how might they encourage the diversity and the plurality of voices, and therefore protect against homogeneity and uniformity? Such questions wait for another day and a part of a larger project.